Welcome. This podcast is on acceptance and commitment therapy, and I am Patricia Rowling. This podcast is based on two references. The first is a book by Hayes and Lillis titled Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, and it is available in Hope's Library. The second article is also by Hayes and colleagues, and again, it is on acceptance and commitment therapy. Acceptance and commitment therapy, also known as ACT, is a third generation of cognitive and behavior therapies. The first generation was behavior therapy, which was based on a set of principles that explain behavior through learning dynamics such as operant conditioning, classical conditioning, and modeling. Researchers and psychologists soon realized that this model was limited in being able to understand human behavior and psychopathology, and soon the cognitive aspect was added, hence the second generation, which was cognitive behavior therapy. In cognitive behavior therapy, which looked at thoughts as well as behaviors in understanding human emotions and human interactions, made significant progress in understanding and treating psychological disorders. This third generation goes one step further and looks not only at behaviors and thoughts, but at how one relates to behaviors and thoughts, the context of the behaviors and thoughts. The idea behind ACT is not to change the content of the thoughts as the cognitive behavior therapist would, but rather change the context in which a person deals with the thoughts and manages the thoughts and the emotions. All right, now that we understand a basic overview of ACT, let's talk about how the ACT therapist understands the cause of pathology. First, the ACT therapist does not think in terms of syndromes or diseases as the cognitive therapist would. The cognitive therapist would say that depression is due to a depressive schema, or that anxiety disorders are due to schemas that promote fear and anxiety. The ACT therapist does not look at pathology that way. They see one overarching reason for pathology, and that is the relationship that a person has to their thoughts. Pathology is not unique to specific thoughts. So the source of psychopathology for the ACT therapist is the way language and cognition interact. Specifically, the ACT therapist believes that through years of connecting words with emotions and actions and activities, those emotions and ideas have become fused with the words. Emotions and ideas in all of our past have become fused with words. So when we think of the word dog, we don't just think of an animal with ears and a tail that barks. Instead, all of our past comes into play to fuse with that word dog. We have emotional reactions to the word dog. One person could have wonderful, warm associations to dogs. Another person could have a fearful association to the word dog. A whole network of reactions, both emotional and cognitive, have become fused with the word dog. And it's very difficult for us to detach all these emotional reactions that we have to words because of our lifetime of experiences that have been conditioned with words. What happens through this lifetime of association with words and events and emotional reactions is that we develop cognitive networks that are associated with different words and concepts. And our behaviors can be guided by these involuntary reactions that we have to words and the concepts associated with words. Another source of pathology is when an individual has an uncomfortable emotion or thought, like anxiety or like depression. We attempt to nullify those thoughts or emotions or to avoid them. Anxiety is a great example of this. When we are anxious, we try to do everything we can to tamp down that emotion, to try to get rid of the emotion. According to the ACT therapist, this attempt to control and to tamp down an emotion only makes it more salient and makes it more difficult to suppress. It keeps coming back. So by trying to suppress emotions, we actually increase their focus, and that creates more distress. For example, a person is anxious, they try to control their anxiety and they can't, and that even makes them more anxious. As people live in their heads, as they let thoughts and reactions to those thoughts dominate their lives, they stop living in the present and instead live in their heads. And this is not healthy. This can create pathology. And because of this cognitive fusion and avoidance, people do not pursue long-term goals that reflect their values. Instead, they spend a lot of time reacting to thoughts that they perceive as being real and trying to avoid emotions that they can't control. So how does the ACT therapist treat disorders? The crux of their theory is that we don't have to focus on the content of cognitive networks. We don't have to look at what a person is thinking about. If we focus on the thoughts, then this can potentially activate a thought pattern and even make it more intransigent. So looking at the thoughts, analyzing the thoughts, trying to argue somebody out of those thoughts can only make that network more activated and may even work against the goals of treatment. These thought patterns are firmly entrenched and cannot be completely inhibited. So the cognitive therapist who tries to get people to change the way they think are not going to be completely successful. There will be remnants of these schemas that will still continue to influence behavior. They cannot be completely inhibited. So the goal of ACT is not to eliminate these thoughts, but to reduce the impacts that the thoughts have upon an individual. So the overreaching goal of ACT is to increase psychological flexibility. Now, what does that mean? It means contacting the present moment fully and changing behavior in the service of chosen values. Let's dig deeper into psychological flexibility, which is the end goal of ACT. Psychological flexibility involves acceptance. This is the opposite of avoidance. In the example I spoke about earlier, the person who is anxious spends a lot of time trying to get rid of these anxious feelings. The person who's depressed spends a lot of time trying to not feel depressed, trying to get rid of those feelings. Well, the ACT therapist says, don't avoid it, embrace it, feel it, acknowledge it, understand it. This will stop the emotion from being overwhelming and feeling out of control. Next, the person must be in the present. That means acknowledging one's emotions and one's thoughts, experience them, don't be judgmental about them. Don't get down on oneself for feeling anxious or feeling depressed or feeling angry. Next, self as context. Basically, this means separate oneself from the thoughts. The thoughts are there. That does not mean you have to believe them. That does not mean that they're true. That does not mean that they have to affect one's behavior. See them as thoughts, as objects, as something separate from oneself. Try to disconnect all of the emotions and the acceptance that one has of these thoughts as being real, as being something that must influence behavior. So don't try to change the thoughts. Don't try to argue oneself out of the thoughts. Don't try to tamp down the thoughts. Instead, change the way one relates to these thoughts. Next, the ACT therapist explores a person's values. How do they make meaning in life? What do they want to do with their life? And to help the person choose directions in life that reflect those values, rather than spending life reacting to thoughts and emotions that are troubling. Once the person has identified their values, then the ACT therapist tries to get them to commit to action that reflects those values. So as someone is having an episode of anxiety or an episode of depression, they would understand that feeling, accept that feeling, see it as being separate from themselves, and then be able to move past that feeling, put it behind them, and move forward and act in concert with their principles and goals. Now, in this therapy, what are the roles of the therapist and the client? Well, the role of the client is really very similar to what we found with non-directive or client-centered therapy. The client is the one who's supposed to know best how to develop and how to actualize. So the therapist really tries to allow the client to understand their emotions, what triggers them, and how to defuse thoughts from emotions. The role of the therapist then is to really help the client become more fully aware of themselves, to stimulate this process, but only the client knows where therapy should go and what is best for them. The therapist also helps the client be in the present, helps the client learn psychological flexibility, which can lead to health. And the therapist helps the client live a life that is consistent with that client's values. Also very similar to client-centered therapy, the therapist must model flexibility, this psychological flexibility, and genuineness. So it is important that the therapist be psychologically healthy as well if they are to lead the client through this process. Okay, so that is ACT therapy in a nutshell. Again, it is considered under the umbrella of cognitive behavior therapies, but it is a therapy that adds this third dimension, this looking at the context of thoughts and how one relates to them, not the content. This ends this podcast.